There we go. Thank you for joining me today. You should be seeing a slide screen that says Developing Fraud Policy and Investigating Fraud. Today, we will be covering this topic that is very important. We will discuss the importance of having strong fraud policies and procedures in place, how to recognize fraud, and the actions you as a grantee need to take when concerns arise. I do believe I am recording. Yes. Okay. Just checking. So this training is being recorded so that grantees can share it with staff and with subrecipients. We will also host a listening session to hear your thoughts on fraud, its impact on your agency, and to answer any questions that we can. You are encouraged to watch this training and bring your questions and concerns to the listening session. This video will remain available for ongoing reference. If at any time you have questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out. We are here to support you in any way that we can. For the record, I'm Sheila Parkins, just one of the homeless program analysts in the homeless services section of Oregon Housing and Community Services, and you will be going on this journey with me today. So let's begin. Having strong internal policies and procedures to address fraud are an important aspect of grant management. Fraud harms everyone, making costs higher for delivering programs, creating financial harm to the organization and the state or federal government that provides the funding, stresses an already stressed system, and can significantly damage reputations and reduce an organization's ability to receive funding. Developing a strong set of fraud policies and procedures will take time. Oregon recognizes this and is providing sufficient time and training so that grantees can be successful. Beginning in the 27-29 biennium, we will again be requiring policies to be submitted for approval by OHCS within your Master Grant Agreement funding application. A fraud policy will be a new requirement. However, we're going to provide you with plenty of time for development and will ensure that you have a policy template to start with and that you will be ready to submit your policy in May of 2027. We recognize that you will be building this from the ground up, and we are making every effort to provide assistance along the way. Briefly, today we will cover what fraud is, the common types of fraud, and the risks, and then we'll pivot into the policy requirement and template that you will be able to use to develop your fraud policy. And then finally, we will move into fraud management and the how to investigate fraud complaints or fraudulent activities. So let's begin. At its core, fraud is an act, expression, omission, or concealment calculated to induce another person to part with something of value or to surrender a legal right. Fraud includes attempts to gain financial benefit or to corrupt or influence agency staff. Fraud could be actions that lead to suspension or debarment from state or federal programs due to misconduct or noncompliance. And it includes violations of federal laws such as the False Claims Act and the Anti-Kickback Act. Violations of these acts carry significant legal consequences, including civil or criminal penalties. Fraudulent conduct is serious and it carries with it real-life consequences. Two common types of fraud are one at the client level and two at the employee level. Client fraud may include falsified eligibility documentation, such as lease agreements created online, indication of a relative that normally lives with the household being identified as a separate household or a roommate, failure to disclose income or disclose all household members, and using friends or relatives to receive payments or to help falsify documentation. Employee fraud may include forging approvals and signatures, use of a company credit card for personal trips or purchases, embezzlement of funds, usage of gift cards for personal purposes, or falsifying client information. The risk of falsifying client information is particularly heightened when an employee is also a client. Online scams and phishing attacks also continue to surge as criminals exploit digital vulnerabilities. Unfortunately, workplace fraud is a persistent risk and can include asset misappropriation, payroll fraud, bribery, corruption, and financial statement fraud. The increasing reliance on digital tools requires that organizations deploy advanced fraud prevention strategies. A clear structure ensures a thorough, legally sound approach to discovering and prosecuting fraud. Investigation phases form the foundation for effective fraud management, and we'll get more into investigating fraud later in this presentation. I want to touch on digital vulnerabilities for a brief moment. Scams and schemes remain widespread and ever-changing due to social engineering and technological manipulation. Common technology-related fraud includes theft of a person's identity, either by means of accessing a person's computer and information or by buying a stolen identity from another person who has gotten your personal data. Money mule scams are when a person is recruited knowingly or unknowingly to transfer or move illegally acquired money without realizing the criminal implications of their actions. Financial fraud includes the deliberate use of deception to illegally obtain money, assets, or financial information from individuals, businesses, or institutions. Romance scams occur online when a person feigns romantic interest in someone to obtain either money or enough personal information for the scammer to access their financial accounts for their own purpose. Investment scams offer quick and easy profits in financial markets, cryptocurrency, real estate or precious metals, and tech support scams can include a person reaching out to you electronically claiming to be from Microsoft or some other organization, or you see a pop-up window on your computer or phone with a fake warning message and a phone call to get your issue fixed. Sometimes they provide you a link that, if you click, will install malware to either corrupt your system or gain access to it. This is true with lookalike websites that look legit but may have a domain name that has one or two characters that are slightly different and sends you to a malicious site. Digital vulnerabilities are real and ever present. Strong cybersecurity measures help to reduce the risk of fraud, and providing your employees with continual training in recognizing scams is essential to prevent misuse of information. Your confidentiality and cybersecurity policy can help to mitigate these risks. Being able to understand the risks of fraud is critical as fraud can impact multiple areas. Individuals may suffer financial losses or identity theft, while organizations face asset theft, costly fines, and damage to their reputation. At the program level, fraud undermines integrity and erodes trust, weakening overall effectiveness and advocacy for programs designed to help meet the needs of those most in need. Now that you have a general understanding of fraud and the risk, let's talk about the requirement for a fraud policy. A strong fraud policy outlines the expectations, responsibilities, and procedures you put in place to prevent, detect, and address fraudulent activity. It provides clear guidance for employees on recognizing potential fraud risks, reporting concerns promptly, and understanding the consequences of fraudulent behavior. The policy reinforces the organization's commitment to integrity, accountability, and the protection of public resources, ensuring that all staff play a role in maintaining a transparent and trustworthy work environment. Fraud is mentioned 23 times in the Office of Management Budget OMB 200, which any organization that receives federal funds must adhere to, and it stresses the importance. Grantees must ensure that they have a strong policy in place. It will ensure that there is a mechanism to report fraud, waste, and abuse, and to detail the actions the organization will take to mitigate such risks. Grantees of OHCS funds should hold a zero tolerance stance on fraud, waste, and abuse. Organizations must correct issues promptly to avoid consequences, such as repayment of funds, loss of future funding, or criminal, civil, or administrative penalties. Relevant laws include U.S. Code Title 18 and Title 31. Reducing the risk and the impact of fraud depends on vigilance, education, and technology adoption. Organizations and individuals must implement effective controls to detect threats early. Protecting against fraud requires knowledge of the techniques criminals use to commit fraud. Stay informed about scams, beware of unsolicited requests, and safeguard sensitive information. Your organization is required to have a confidentiality and cybersecurity policy for safeguarding your systems and data. So be sure you know where to find that policy and that you fully know and understand the steps that you need to take that will help you to mitigate the risks of fraud. Regular monitoring is also a requirement, and both OHCS monitoring and our grantees and our grantees monitoring of their subrecipients includes activities that can help identify any fraud before significant losses occur. Now let's pivot to the fraud policy itself. We will have this policy template available in our SharePoint Master Downloads folder for the MGA materials. I will also be including it in an emailed program update notification when I make this video available. Now, I know this is a very heavy, text-heavy slide, and I do not expect to read it during this presentation, as it will be available to you afterwards. However, I want to point out that like in all of our other policy templates, we will have language that we expect to see in every fraud policy. This required language begins the policy template, and then we provide a space in which grantees can customize the steps or activities that your staff will take related to the policy. Please note that while many organizations may be watching this training, the requirement to submit to OHCS your fraud policy is only applicable to community action agencies receiving grants administered by the Homeless Services Section. While we encourage all organizations to develop and maintain a fraud policy, only community action agencies will have to submit the policy in their master grant agreement materials. This template is going to solidify some very specific points. First, a commitment to integrity in the programs and state and federal organizations funding these programs and to their auditors. An intention to take corrective action to reduce fraud, waste, and abuse. Then citing of relevant statutes. We include a definition of fraud and the penalties for fraud, and the policy will include a statement of understanding that when applying for state and federal funds, your organization will submit true, complete, and accurate information. It outlines the purpose, intent, and need for fraud investigations and covers the documentation requirements related to fraud reporting and the investigations. Finally, it outlines the 10 steps to investigating fraud. Again, at the end, you will have an opportunity to customize this policy with your agency's reporting methodology, whether you use an anonymous email, templates for reporting fraud, waste, and abuse, a dedicated phone line, internal elevation structures such as a direct supervisor, a division lead, agency head, board, or other steps, and an opportunity to add details to any of the required language shown at the beginning of the policy template. This template will ensure that you are best poised to develop a policy and be able to submit one that will comply with OHCS requirements in May of 2027. Roommate situations are areas of high fraud probability, and due diligence is needed to ensure that such situations are adequately documented. I wanted to cover roommate fraud while we discuss fraud in this presentation because it is so frequent. I want to take time to to cover self-certifications or a dependence on client statements, as they are not valid methods of meeting documentation requirements for roommate situations. Roommates may be friends or family members that normally live with a person at no cost, and then when determined state funds are available, leases are created and funding is requested for these friends and family members as rent when they didn't previously have any agreement for paying rent. That is definitely fraud. There are two scenarios that could take place. One scenario is when tenant A is an authorized tenant paying rent to a landlord, and tenant B moves in with tenant A. This frequently occurs with students or younger persons when a group of two or more decide to move in together and share expenses. Typically, these rental agreements will show all members of the unit, but only one payment is accepted by the landlord for the total amount of rent. And that occurs because landlords do not want to accept partial payments. Rent agreements usually have a separate and severable clause in them. That means if one term is found invalid or unenforceable, the remaining tenants are still binding. The remaining terms are still binding on all parties. This is also used for the purposes of payments. Even if one person is on time, if all are not, then all can be evicted or suffer late fees, in which then all would be responsible. When just one of the four tenants comes in for assistance, you could pay that person's share of the rent, but not the rent for all tenants. The only way that we could pay the total amount of rent is that if all four tenants apply together as a single household. Otherwise, OHCS funds could pay a fair and equitable proration of the rent. If the rent is $1,000 and only one of the four tenants comes in requesting 800, that would cue you into something being amiss because 25% of the rent should not be covered by 80% of, or 25% of the tenants should not cover 80% of the cost. In this scenario, rent is typically paid to the landlord directly. But if the landlord will not accept the partial payment, it could be paid to the roommate tenant responsible for the single payment. However, there could also be tax consequences to this happening. So folks should understand that. We do not authorize payments directly to the client for any purpose, so a payment to the person applying would not be acceptable. A payment to another tenant could also be indicative of a fraud situation, so beware. The second scenario is when tenant A is the owner and tenant B is a person who has moved in with the owner of the building. This is much more common, particularly in fraud. This type of scenario is, in a fraudulent case, is much harder to detect because typically both the owner and the tenant are working together. In this case, you still hold the same documentation standards, needing proof of a rent agreement and history of previous rental payments. This is where the digital signature for rental agreements comes into play much more significantly than in the first scenario, as pulling rental agreements off the internet and just typing in names is a common fraud activity. Digital signatures must capture the IP address of the signer. You can check the IP address to see if it's the same as the owner. If they are using the same computer, it is likely indicative of a fraud attempt. The images on this slide show a digital signature that identifies the IP address and is date and time stamped. So, what do you want to make sure that you have in roommate scenarios? You want documentation that the authorized tenant has authority and approval by the landlord to have additional persons living in the unit. Check the rental agreement that there are no restrictions in the authorized tenant's rental agreement to subleasing or adding people to the unit. If there are such provisions, this could be a fraud attempt. You may need both a copy of the authorized tenant and you need a copy of the authorized tenant's rental agreement, a copy of the roommate rental agreement, and make sure there is evidence of financial transactions by the applicant showing at least 3 months of previous payment history for rent. 3 months is a strong measure. It is not a requirement, but it is a strong measure. Evidence of payments cannot be handwritten or self-certified. This must be proven with bank statements, PayPal or Venmo statements, cashier check receipts, etc. If such evidence does not exist, payments must be made directly to the landlord if you're going to make the payment. If they're unable to pay the landlord directly, the payment would not be allowable. You can also check county assessor records online, which is free and will show you who the owner of the property is, as a double check that the owner is the person who says that they are the owner. You can also call the county tax assessor department and give them the address to find out the owner's name as well, if the online system doesn't work for you. Be alert, require documentation, and recognize that roommates are an extremely common area in which fraud attempts occur. The rest of this presentation will be training on performing fraud investigations. I'll cover the purpose of fraud investigations, how to document them, what it encompasses, and how to do it. We will dive into the 10 steps of a fraud investigation in detail. Let's begin with what a fraud investigation is. A fraud investigation is a systematic process for collecting and analyzing evidence of suspected fraud, critical for uncovering criminal fraud schemes and holding perpetrators accountable. An investigation reduces long-term risks, deters future misconduct, and recovers lost assets. Fraud investigations often begin with the detection of irregularities. Excuse me, such as abnormal transactions, whistleblower reports, or suspicious patterns within audits. Investigations can also start after complaints from customers or regulatory bodies. The phases of the investigation form the foundation for effective fraud management. At its core, the purpose of a fraud investigation is to uncover fraudulent activities, identify those responsible, and gather evidence to take appropriate corrective or legal actions. It aims to assess the extent of the fraud, prevent reoccurrence, and protect the organization. A variety of qualified professionals may be involved in conducting investigations, depending on the nature and the complexity of the issue. Internal compliance staff or compliance officers often lead the process, supported by specialists such as forensic accountants and IT forensic experts who analyze financial data and digital evidence. Legal counsel may guide the investigations to ensure adherence to legal and regulatory requirements. In some cases, organizations bring in external investigators to provide independent expertise. When matters involve potential criminal activities, law enforcement agencies may also become involved. A fraud investigation's timeline vary, often lasting several weeks to months, depending on the case complexity, the amount of data to be reviewed, and the numbers of parties involved. High-profile cases may also require extensive forensic analysis. If fraud is confirmed, offenders may face criminal charges, civil penalties, restitution requirements, or imprisonment depending on the offense severity. Courts often order asset recovery and compensation for victims. Documentation plays a critical role in an investigation because it creates a clear, factual record of what occurred, how the investigation was conducted, and what evidence supports the findings. Thorough documentation preserves details that might otherwise be forgotten, allows others to review and verify the investigation, and provides a defensible foundation for any disciplinary, corrective, or legal actions that follow. Strong, organized documentation also demonstrates objectivity and credibility, helping protect the organization in the event of audits, challenges, or external reviews. Access to information must be restricted only to individuals who need it, and discreet interviews should be conducted with those who may have relevant knowledge to avoid alerting others or influencing testimony. All sensitive documents and evidence should be confidentially secured to prevent loss, tampering, or unauthorized access. Additionally, organizations need to investigate fraud through an equity framework. Regardless of the source, all reports of fraud must be considered credible until facts prove otherwise. Meet complainants where they are at. For instance, if the complaint is from a worker, ensure that privacy is given when interviewing them. If a complaint was made by the public, ensure that you are able to follow up with them in a manner that is most convenient for them, whether that be by phone, email, or even text. Ensure that you document all contact appropriately for the investigation record. Follow your policy and procedures step by step to ensure that all complaints are treated to the same level of investigation. Follow your non-discrimination policy and ensure that no decision is made that would cause the organization to refuse to accept an application or deny an application for assistance, set different terms, conditions, or privileges for assistance, provide different or specific housing, facilities, or services, or deny anyone access to assistance based on a protected class. Document, document, document all aspects of the investigation from complaint to resolution. This provides evidence that all complaints are treated equitably. By applying equity principles, investigators can ensure that their work is thorough, timely, accurate, compliant, and ultimately protects the integrity of our programs, our organizations, the public, and the interests of the parties involved. Now that we've covered the foundations of fraud and its impacts, we're ready to explore how fraud investigations work and the steps involved in identifying, analyzing, and addressing suspected misconduct. So let's dig into fraud investigations. Step one is deciding on whether or not you even need an investigation. You may discover fraud during the course of your tasks as an employee, spotting an irregularity in processing or approvals, or you may receive a tip alerting you to potential fraud through an anonymous tip line, a report to a manager, or even through a report completed by the public. You need to evaluate the information you receive to determine if there is sufficient cause to begin an investigation. Step two is assessing the situation. When performing a basic assessment, consider which policies or laws may have been violated, whether multiple individuals might be involved, do any of the suspects have a previous history or similar behaviors, are any red flags exhibited, such as an employee living beyond their means or working unusual hours, or maybe a client received repeated payments through multiple different providers, or a specific subrecipient is always using only self-certification methods for documentation. Evaluate both internal and external risk factors to determine the scope and seriousness of the potential issue. Next, in step three, decide if you will use an internal or external investigator. An internal investigator is typically inexpensive and gives you control over the timing and scope of the investigation. Using staff can avoid contract expenses and may give you the best option for lower risk cases. It is also easier to coordinate investigations, and staff have ready access to records, systems, and personnel. An external investigator, on the other hand, offers an impartial and objective perspective on the situation, but may cost more than your organization can afford. External investigators may be useful for high profile or sensitive cases. External investigators also offer expertise that organization staff may not have in order to do forensic analyses or for unraveling complex fraud schemes. You may opt for a hybrid approach and do some foundational investigation prior to bringing in an expert. Whatever you decide, be sure that you have an idea of what you're hoping your final outcome will be and select the right investigator for the job. Step four involves initial interviews. If there is a whistleblower, interview the person who reported the fraud for context. If the fraud was discovered by an auditor or other person reporting the issue, interview them. Request that they provide you with any documentation that they have on the issue. Based on the information these witnesses share, determine whether you have a reasonable factual basis for an investigation. If you don't, contact other sources for more information. For example, if the accused person is internal staff, you may contact the accused person's manager or coworker and look for other documents, emails, or data that could help provide substantiating evidence of a fraud issue. If there's no one else left to talk to, or you still can't reach the factual basis, an investigation may not be appropriate. However, always exercise confidentiality when investigating fraud and only share information with those who have a need to know. And be sure to document your steps and your decisions to reflect your due diligence in addressing the original catalyst that took you on the path. In step 5, you will want to take necessary interim actions to reduce the damages caused by fraud and to stop it as soon as it's detected. Change passwords and locks to prevent further theft of data or funds. If the alleged fraudster is a client or a customer, suspend any payments and ensure that they are flagged for potential fraud so that nothing is processed prior to the conclusion of your investigation. If your investigation determines that no fraud occurred, don't forget to remove the flags. If you suspect an employee of fraud, consider temporarily suspending them with full pay until the investigation is complete to ensure a lack of access to systems, the building, or records that could be further tampered with or changed. Clearly communicate that actions taken are not a disciplinary action or punitive measure and document the conversation. This step can protect you if an employee raises additional concerns that they are being treated unfairly. Step 6 is heavily focused on documentation. Reread your organization's policies surrounding ethics, confidentiality, cybersecurity, compliance, and other relevant topics. Identify and review any relevant laws, regulations, or internal policies related to the fraud. This can help you determine what law or policy was violated. Then prepare for the investigations by reviewing your organization's fraud investigation procedures so that you have a general scope of how to proceed. If you want your fraud investigation to be a success, you can't go into it without a plan. A plan gets your team all on the same page regarding the investigation's goals, methods, and deadlines. Remember, be flexible as your plan might change as the investigation progresses. Identify exactly what you are trying to learn through the investigation. For example, what policy was allegedly violated and by whom? Keep the investigation scope as narrow as possible to protect innocent people. Having a clearly defined scope not only keeps your fraud investigations on track, but also ensures that it is fair and compliant. Figure out which authorities or regulators that you need to report to if you determine fraud has occurred, such as reporting to Oregon Housing and Community Services. This step helps you to set a timeline and gives your investigation strategy and purpose. A clear strategy helps ensure that you don't miss key information or duplicate efforts during the investigation. As you develop the plan, consider what you already know, what you still need to find out, who you need to question, and who will do the questioning, what documents must be reviewed and where can they be accessed, and which methods you will use to prove or disprove the allegation. Clarify who's responsible for each task, establish the timeline, and determine who will need to be informed of the investigation's outcome. In other words, what do you need to do to investigate, and who did what actions and in violation of what? Who, what, when, where, and how did they do it? Who needs to complete what steps and by when? Asking questions and discovering the answers is what a fraud investigation is all about. Next, make a list of individuals who could offer insight into the suspected fraud. Start with the reporter, if there was one, and if the suspect is an employee, the employee's manager. The suspect's colleagues, friends, and family may also be able to provide motive, background, and other information that corroborates or contradicts the allegation. Experts, such as forensic accountants and data scientists, can help you figure out how the fraud was committed. Interview the suspect last. That way, you can ask them about the details that came up in the other interviews. Finally, create a realistic timeline. Set deadlines for each stage of the fraud investigation process, including interviews, document retrieval, and reaching a conclusion. Assign tasks to members of your investigation team based on their strengths and subject matter expertise. For instance, you may need to connect with your fiscal staff to dig into the approval of payments, when they happened, and who performed the work. Work fast to increase your chance of recovering losses and decrease the risk of losing evidence, while avoiding the kind of rushing that can lead to errors or oversight. Be efficient. Records review is a critical component to any fraud investigation. You must review records, documents, photos, videos, and other evidence to substantiate the claim of fraudulent activity. Records provide information that interviewees may forget or intentionally withhold. Looking through an email history may reveal signs of fraud either by a client or an employee. You may identify complaints about their finances or requests for funds that exceed standards. For internal fraud, make sure your internal policies, such as your confidentiality and cybersecurity policy, make it clear that you can access employee work emails at any time. If there is more than one suspect, read their correspondence with each other to find evidence of a fraud scheme. Review all relevant business transactions. This must include all documents relevant to a payment, including eligibility documents, payment requests, payment transactions, and payment deposits. Determine how far back you go. Was it one payment, multiple payments, over a month, 6 months, a year? Who was associated with those payments? Who was involved in processing the payments? Was it an employee who is also a friend of the client or a relative? Were the appropriate separation of duties exercised? What funding sources were payments coming from? Was it state funds, local funds, or federal funds? What agencies may you have to report to? Who who were payments issued to, and what accounts were involved? How often were payments made, and what's the total dollar amount of the suspected fraud? Ensure your review is as in-depth and covers the full breadth and scope of the suspected fraudulent activity. When reviewing documents, focus only on those that are relevant to the investigation, including items that capture information as it existed at the time that they were created, such as emails, instant messages, and Microsoft Teams communications. Documents provide a snapshot of the time that they were created and either support or do not substantiate the fraud claim. Avoid examining materials outside the scope of the investigation, as doing so can create confusion and unnecessary complications. Sticking to relevant records keeps the investigation organized and on track. Limiting the review to necessary documents also reduces liability if the alleged fraudster later challenges the findings. As you investigate, keep originals and do not remove them so that they can be accessed in the future and maintains a clear connection to other records in the system. It might also be prudent to lock access to records once fraud is suspected. This can keep records from being edited in shared drives or in database systems like case notes or other areas like fiscal records. If you have this ability to lock or limit access, you may want to do so to ensure that no records tampering occurs prior to the completion of your investigation. Make and keep copies of records on hand in your investigation file for easy access and for further review. Copies allow you to make notes without damaging the originals and keeps originals in their appropriate location. This allows you to highlight or annotate relevant facts. Label your copies with dates, sources, and case number for clarity. If you use a case management system, you can organize all the investigation information together, including interview notes, records, and other evidence. Be sure to upload documents promptly to keep the case file complete and ensure that you follow confidentiality and chain of custody requirements when storing sensitive information. Interviewing can be an important part of any investigation. This is the stage when you gather the information you need to draw a conclusion from firsthand sources. It's a good idea to have a second investigator on or an assistant in an interview to take notes so that the person performing the interview can concentrate on the interviewee. Many investigators record interviews. While some feel this can make the interviewee nervous, in Oregon, you do need to be sure that you have permission of all participants prior to recording a verbal conversation. Begin each interview by explaining what will happen and what you expect of the interviewee. This allows you to stay in control while putting their mind at ease. Explain that their answers will be kept confidential wherever possible. If the interviewee is an employee, assure them that they'll be protected from retaliation, citing your organization's anti-retaliation policy. Allow everyone an opportunity to introduce themselves so that everyone knows everyone else and what their role will be in the interview. While you may be tempted to use an interview script, opt for an outline instead. The interviewee's answers, not your questions, are the evidence, so your wording isn't as important as the information that you receive. Plus, an outline allows the conversation to flow more naturally than a rigid script. Interviewees are more likely to open up to a friendly person. Start by making small talk rather than diving right into tough questions. Make them comfortable and thank them at both the beginning and the end of the interview. No matter what information they provide, keep a positive attitude. First, set a baseline with easy questions, such as what is your position or how long have you known the subject? Ask open-ended questions to avoid leading the interviewee. For example, instead of are you the subject's friend, ask what is your relationship to the subject? Use clear, plain language. Avoid jargon or acronyms that they may not know, and if you use acronyms, be sure that you define it the first time that you use it. Finally, make sure that your questions are straightforward and not designed to be a gotcha moment. This is a fact-finding activity. Keep emotions out of the question to the degree possible. Provide support to the interviewee, whether that is being able to allow them space to vent or emote, or whether that is explaining whistleblower protections or resources that are available, such as an employee assistance program. Analyze the evidence by reviewing all gathered information to determine whether you have enough to reach a well-supported conclusion. Assess whether the facts are sufficient to guide decision makers in correcting the issue and preventing it from recurring. In internal fraud investigations, an inconclusive outcome is not acceptable, as organizations must be able to act on findings. This urgency is underscored by estimates from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, which indicates that organizations lose about 5% of their revenue to fraud each year. Assess the quality of the evidence by analyzing everything that you've gathered and ensuring that only strong, reliable information is used in the investigation. Evidence should be concrete rather than subjective, specific, relevant to the investigation, competent, and authentic. If any piece of evidence fails to meet these standards, it should not be used when forming conclusions. Keeping the evidence base solid helps maintain the credibility and accuracy of the investigation's findings. Confidentiality is key for any investigations, but especially important in fraud cases. Lock up physical evidence. Protect digital information by encrypting files or using a secure case management platform with role-based access. As an investigator, it's your job to uncover facts based on evidence, not make judgments or assumptions. When drawing a conclusion, rely on the evidence and use only objective facts, not inferences or assumptions or personal beliefs. The goal of a fraud investigation is to prove or disprove each element of the allegation. Did the alleged behavior occur, and did the alleged fraudster do it? If you can't achieve this with the evidence that you've gathered, keep working until you have a conclusion. Let's look at an example. You received an allegation from an employee stating that another employee, Jane, stole petty cash on March 31st. The work schedules that you've reviewed prove that Jane was working on March 31st. Interviews you conducted determined that Jane was one of 3 people with access to petty cash, and that unaccounted funds have no corresponding receipts. Security footage shows that only Jane opened the locked location that day where such funds were held, and that she removed funds from that location and then took a break immediately after, leaving the building with her purse. A review of the petty cash ledger and a physical count of the petty cash available shows that $400 was missing. These pieces of evidence corroborate the allegation that petty cash was stolen on March 31st and that it was Jane that took it. A well-written report, because of its reliance on facts and not speculation, shows both that you have done your job and that you met your responsibilities. Your fraud investigation report should be simple, factual, and limited by the scope of your investigation. An investigation report should include your investigative approach, facts, and analysis of the evidence, a determination, and any recommendations for corrective action. Once a report is complete, it may lead to legal conclusions for pursuit of repayment or further report to local police. The report itself should focus on whether an internal policy was violated and how you came to that conclusion. The final investigation report should present facts, not your opinions or judgment. To keep it objective, avoid using words like allegedly or supposedly. Don't use inflammatory or negative language. For example, say, during her interview, Jane looked around the room and avoided eye contact, rather than Jane seemed nervous and shifty. In addition, never say that your determination is an outright fact. Instead, report that the investigation determined the elements of the allegation. So let's go back to our example. For instance, this is what the end of your conclusion could read for the example with Jane. The investigation concluded on June 10th. The investigation determined that Jane was one of 3 people with a key and authority to access petty cash per a review of position descriptions and an interview with the other 2 individuals with keys determining that no key had been lost or misused. Per review of security video from the date of the last petty cash log entry on March 30th through June 10th, Jane was the only person to access the location where petty cash was held, and on March 31st, she removed an undetermined amount of cash and then immediately left the building with her purse and returned 5 minutes later. No records were found for purchases after March 30th. The investigator performed an audit of petty cash, identifying the starting balance as $1,000 and the ending balance as $750. A physical count of the remaining cash determined that $350 was remaining in the locked location on June 10th, and receipts attached to the logbook of allowable expenses added up to $250, leaving an unaccounted amount of $400. In the June 9th interview of Jane, she stated, "I don't know about the petty cash because I haven't needed it for coffee since January," and stated, "I still have my key and didn't loan it to anyone." The conclusion is that Jane removed $400 of petty cash on March 31st without providing evidence of an allowable use of petty cash per petty cash policy 40.100. When writing the report, include direct quotations when possible. You'll be less likely to misconstrue an interviewee's words and reduces your risk of a challenge to your determination. Refer back to your notes or interview records so that you can include as many quotes as possible. If the accused person confesses or admits to fraud, report exactly what they said. Limit your use of jargon, acronyms, and technical terms. If you must use them, define each word or phrase the first time you use it in the report. Your fraud investigation report should be able to stand on its own without supplementary documents or knowledge. If it doesn't, simplify and edit until anyone can understand it. You never know if your report might be read by someone who doesn't know technical terms, such as a board member or external experts. Describe the records that you used as evidence and the facts that you found in each one. Include copies of written and visual records, plus links or information on where to find other forms of evidence that you cited. Reference organizational policies and procedures that were violated by the fraudster as well. Attach each of these documents with key passages highlighted. Finally, end with your investigation conclusion. Ensure that your report is saved in appropriate spaces. Share your report with your leadership and ensure that it is provided to the appropriate staff within your organization, and if required, provide it to your funder. Determine the next steps. Do you need to make corrective entries in your fiscal records? Do you need to sue a client or recipient of funds to attempt to recapture funds that were distributed? Do you need to repay your funder? Do you need to correct or modify processes or procedures? Maybe you need to report a theft to local law enforcement. Ensure that you determine what the next steps are and then document your follow through and complete those corrective activities. I know this was a lot of information, but this does wrap up my presentation. As a reminder, we will be hosting an office hours to provide space and time to ask questions related to these materials. OHCS staff will be on hand to assist in any way that we can in your development of a fraud policy and in determining your role and responsibility in understanding and mitigating fraud risks. If you are unable to make the office hours, or if you are watching past the time that this was scheduled, feel free to reach out to me directly at the email noted on this slide, or reach out to your specific OHCS program analyst. Thank you for attending and have a great rest of your day.